November 24th, 1326. The city of Hereford. The air is frigid, but the crowd roars with hatred. Hugh Despenser, the most hated man in England, is led to the scaffold. Queen Isabella watches in person, seeing not justice, but the culmination of her personal revenge. He is executed on charges of usurping royal authority. And herein lies the central paradox, the key to the entire story. Every decision Despenser made was with the full consent and at the direct command of King Edward II. The absurdity of the situation is that his judges, Queen Isabella and her ally Roger Mortimer, are at that very moment committing a genuine coup d'etat. This is not a trial. It is theater, where the victim is accused of the very crime his executioners are committing in real time. It is an inversion of justice, its dark reflection. So, what is truly hidden behind this legal farce? This spectacle presents us with two fundamental questions. First, how did the English legal system allow the official, royal chamberlain, to be condemned for carrying out the monarch's will, and to do so at the demand of those who were overthrowing that will by force? The second question is even more disturbing. For nobles, there was a swift and honorable execution, beheading. Why instead was an elaborate ritual of torture devised for Despenser, where every step from castration to the burning of his heart was filled with precise political symbolism? This was driven not just by political calculation, but by a deep personal hatred. The answers to these questions are the key to this entire investigation. By the end of this video, you will no longer see Despenser's execution as chaotic violence. You will learn to read it as a political manifesto, where every act was a calculated and ruthless message. Here are 3 key points on our investigative map. In 4 minutes, you will learn which specific act by Hugh Despenser turned the Queen of England into his mortal enemy. In 9 minutes, we will dissect the 14 articles of accusation and see how personal revenge was disguised as law. And in 15 minutes, we will decipher the secret language of his execution, understanding that every blow from the executioner was aimed at the king himself. This isn't just a story. It's a universal case study on how power asserts itself through public spectacle. How did a knight with no lands or influence become the unofficial ruler of England in just a few years? The answer lies not in his talents, but in the king's psychology. This relationship worked like breathing. Edward II exhaled weakness and indecision, and Despenser inhaled that void, filling it with his own will. But the nobility did not accept this bond. In 1321, the most powerful barons in the country forced the king to sign a decree exiling the Despensers. His power proved fragile. However, his triumphant return after the Battle of Boroughbridge changed him. He became not just influential, but vengeful and ruthless. And this vengefulness demanded entirely new instruments of control. He held no title of regent. So, what invisible levers did he use to subordinate all of England? The first lever, complete control over the royal treasury and the king's privy seal. He filtered all access to the monarch, isolating him even from Queen Isabella. But after the victory at Boroughbridge, he ceased to be a shadow player. He unleashed a reign of terror, executing 22 rebel barons. It was the largest single execution of English nobility in the country's history. It was at this moment, by humiliating the queen and seizing her lands, that he made his greatest mistake. He turned a political opponent into a mortal enemy. But the queen's hatred was not the only force uniting against him. The accusation of possessing the king's soul was not mere propaganda. Despenser controlled the monarch's daily schedule, his personal decisions, and his family relationships. To the medieval mind, this was a violation of the divine order. But the picture changed when Roger Mortimer entered the scene. an escapee whom Despenser had personally humiliated, he formed an alliance with Queen Isabella in France. Hatred for the favorite became an international project. This coalition formed like a wildfire. Isabella's personal hatred was the spark, and the humiliated barons became the dry tinder. Despenser was so focused on controlling the king that he failed to notice an army, driven by a thirst for vengeance, forming against him. And this hatred was poured into an official document of 14 articles that became his death warrant. What is more dangerous for a ruler, a powerful enemy or a friend who is too powerful? Despenser's defense of the king was, in reality, his total isolation. He systematically eliminated all the crown's natural allies, the barons, the church, the family. The illusion of security was complete. Reality struck in 1326. When Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with an army of only 1,500 men, almost no one rose to defend the king. It was enough to seize the kingdom, because the king could not muster even 1,000 loyal soldiers. The fall was swift. Despenser and the king were captured. Now that we know how he reached the summit and how he fell, it is time to dissect the very document that legally justified his execution. And now, let's look at the list of his official crimes. 14 articles of accusation. This was not a legal document, but a masterpiece of propaganda, and its main paradox lay in the very first article, usurping royal authority. The charge was brought by Isabella and Mortimer, who were committing that very crime at that exact moment. To mask this absurdity, they added real facts. Yes, Despenser was no innocent victim. He was corrupt. He seized lands. He used his position for personal enrichment. But hidden among these real crimes were others, deeply personal ones. The humiliation of the queen, the alienation of the king from his lawful wife. Justice turned into a public settling of scores. The goal of this list was not fairness. Its task was to create the image of an absolute monster, deserving not just death, but ritual annihilation. And the most diabolical accusation was aimed not at him, but at the king. It sounded like a plot from a dark fairy tale, possessing the king's soul and will. To the medieval mind, which believed in the divine right of kings, this was tantamount to sorcery. This accusation turned Despenser into an evil sorcerer and Edward II into a will-less puppet. But its real target was not Despenser. It worked like a lever. The point of force was the favorite, but he was being used to overturn the crown itself. If the king's soul could be possessed, then he was not a true anointed of God. This undermined the very foundation of his legitimacy and justified his impending overthrow. The accusations were merely a prelude, creating the image of a monster. But while words echoed in the courtroom, Hugh Despenser himself, around 40 years old, was preparing his final act of defiance. He decided to die, but not in the way his enemies wanted. What does a person do, knowing they face public torture? Despenser chose refusal. After his capture, he began a hunger strike, refusing all food and water. It was a desperate attempt to die on his own terms, to deprive Isabella and Mortimer of their triumphant spectacle. But his plan failed. His enemies needed him alive. He was force-fed to ensure he survived until the trial and execution. The moment the sentence was passed became the culmination of their personal revenge. This was not justice, but a final scene where the humiliation of the victim was the primary goal. The sentence was passed. The attempt to escape his fate had failed. Now we move to its execution. And the public nature of this process was as important a part of the punishment as the executioner's acts itself. Why were the charges not simply recorded in a protocol, but read aloud, theatrically, before the roaring crowd in Hereford? There were two motives. The first, official one, legitimization. Isabella and Mortimer had to show that they were not rebels, but restorers of justice. But there was a second, darker reason. It was a form of psychological torture, forcing a proud aristocrat to stand and listen to an hours-long list of his sins before a jeering crowd was the first stage of the execution, the destruction of his honor before the destruction of his body. But most importantly, each charge read aloud was an announcement of a specific action by the executioner. The sentence was the script, and the execution was its literal, physical embodiment. And the very first act of the executioner was aimed not at killing, but at humiliating. He is hoisted onto the gallows. But here lies the first paradox of this ritual. He is not hanged until dead. He is only briefly strangled and then cut down from the noose, barely alive. In medieval England, hanging was a thief's death, a punishment for commoners. Thus, he, an aristocrat, was ritually demoted. He was to begin dying as a common criminal. But this act had a second, more cruel purpose. He was kept on the verge of asphyxiation, not just for symbolism. He needed to be kept fully conscious, but physically weakened, so he could watch every step of his own body's dismemberment. He was turned from a victim into a spectator. The humiliation of his status was just a prelude. The next blow was aimed not at his position in society, but at his very manhood and his right to a future. The executioner takes a knife. Castration follows. Why was this necessary if the man was already condemned and could not produce heirs? This was direct punishment for the accusations of sodomy and possessing the king's soul. In the eyes of the judges, his male potency was the source of his corrupting influence over the monarch. It had to be destroyed. But a key detail changes everything. His genitals were not just severed. They were burned in a fire before his eyes. In the medieval mind, fire is a symbol of purification. They were not just mutilating. They were publicly burning the heresy from his body. Chroniclers noted, thus was the source of heresy destroyed. But if his manhood was seen as the root of his sin, where, in the judge's view, did the source of his treason lie? The answer was within. The third stage, disembowelment. His abdomen is cut open while he is still alive. Why were his entrails removed and burned? For a person of that era, the heart was the seat of thoughts and loyalty, the bowels, the vessel of foul schemes. By removing them, the executioner symbolically extracted the treason from the criminal's body. But it was more than that. Burning his organs before the crowd was a public ritual of purging the entire kingdom of his corruption. The smoke from his heart was meant to show everyone, the treason has been destroyed. The chronicler Jean Froissart emphasizes, Despenser was alive and saw his own heart thrown into the fire. This was the peak of cruelty. But even the total annihilation of his identity was not the end. His body remained. How can a dead body be punished further? After the disembowelment, Despenser was finally beheaded. But why was his corpse dismembered into 4 parts? This was a standard part of the punishment for high treason in England. His head was displayed on London Bridge as a warning. The 4 parts of his body were sent to the largest cities, Bristol, Dover, York, and Newcastle. But this was not just a warning. It was an eternal damnation. In Christian culture, the integrity of the body was essential for resurrection on Judgment Day. By dismembering his body and scattering it across the country, they were denying him a chance for a proper burial and, in the eyes of his contemporaries, for the salvation of his soul. We have seen in detail how it was done. Every step was filled with cruel but meaningful logic. But to fully understand this spectacle, one must see the frighteningly clear political language in this seemingly senseless brutality. What did the crowd gathered in the square actually see? The execution of an aristocrat, a thief, or an enemy of the state? This distinction was critically important. Hanging, the first act of the ritual, was a clear sign. Before them stood a thief. Thus, he was publicly stripped of his noble status. But then came the disembowelment and quartering, the punishment for high treason. Before everyone's eyes, his crime symbolically shifted from theft to treason. The execution was a spectacle that changed the victim's status in real time to justify the next level of violence. First, he was humiliated to the level of a thief, and then elevated to the status of a traitor deserving total annihilation. And this was not the only symbolic stripping he endured. Why did the executioners dress Despenser in clothes bearing his family's coat of arms, only to mockingly rip them off before the torture began? His surcoat was embroidered with the Despenser coat of arms. It was trampled into the mud. This was a ritual of degradation, a stripping of his knightly dignity. He was becoming a nobody. But a coat of arms is a symbol of an entire lineage. By destroying it, they were symbolically cursing his entire family, his legacy, and his descendants. This was a direct and audacious message to King Edward II, who had personally granted Despenser these titles. They were showing that they could take away everything the king had given. But was the crowd merely a passive spectator, approving of these actions? How did thousands of people react to this monstrous spectacle? The chronicles describe an atmosphere of a cruel carnival. The crowd shouted insults and rejoiced. The execution was a long-awaited show. However, this celebration was not spontaneous. It was the result of a months-long propaganda campaign by Isabella and Mortimer. They had successfully presented Despenser as the root of all the country's problems. The crowd was not a spectator, but a crucial actor. Their cheers of approval legitimized the new ruler's power in the eyes of the entire country. They became accomplices, and this message was not addressed only to them. What was the main message Isabella and Mortimer were sending to the other barons of England? The first layer was obvious. This is what will happen to anyone who remains loyal to the old king. It was an ultimatum. But there was a more subtle, frightening layer. This execution demonstrated a new level of cruelty. The message was, we are the new power, and our methods will be far more ruthless than those of the deposed regime. Do not try to resist us. All these messages were important, but they were secondary. The most important, most personal, and most humiliating message was addressed to one single person, King Edward II. Every blow to the favorite's body was, in fact, a blow to the crown. How did one execution among thousands like it in the Middle Ages become synonymous with cruelty? Many were no less horrific, but history remembers Despenser's name. The answer was provided by medieval chroniclers, most notably Jean Froissart. His vivid, detailed description of the execution became a sensation, copied and retold across Europe. But the picture changes when we look not at how it was described, but at who was executed. The execution of a common rebel is routine. The public annihilation of the second most powerful man in the state, a symbol of royal authority, is an event of civilizational scale. Despenser's execution was the result of a perfect storm, where the viral content of the chroniclers met the victim's exceptionally high status. That is why an act that was essentially lawless became the basis for one of the cruelest laws in English history. How could a judicial travesty organized by rebels become the foundation of state law for centuries? The ritual applied to Despenser was formalized. The procedure of being hanged, drawn, and quartered became the crown's official response to high treason. But the reality was different. Despenser's execution became not just a precedent, but the gold standard for political retribution. The 14 articles of accusation created the illusion of a well-developed legal basis, allowing future rulers to use the same script as a lawful example. This was not the development of law, but the creation of a legal instrument of tyranny. This process is like a wildfire, started by a single spark of lawlessness that burns a new ugly path which then becomes a permanent road for future reprisals. His name became a byword, transforming into an eternal archetype that still lives in our culture today. The name of a tyrant should be cursed and forgotten. But the figure of Despenser has become a timeless subject for theater and literature. His image was immortalized by the stage. In Christopher Marlowe's play, Edward II, written 266 years later, he is portrayed as a tragic but power-corrupted character. However, it is not about one hero. The story of Despenser is a timeless parable about how proximity to power leads to moral decay and reign ruin. He became a cultural mirror into which all subsequent rulers and their favorites have gazed, an eternal warning. But this complex production had one primary spectator for whom it was intended. We have examined how Despenser came to power, what he was tried for, how he was executed, and the legacy he left behind. It seems the story has been told. But what if all of this was just a brilliantly orchestrated diversion? This theater of cruelty had one primary spectator, and that spectator was King Edward II himself. Despenser's execution was not the end of the story, but merely the prologue. It was the most brutal act of public humiliation in history, aimed at a single man, a strike against the shadow to destroy its master. And now we will see how that blow was delivered. Hugh Despenser is dead. Why, then, is this not the end, but the beginning of the irreversible fall of the king himself? How could the murder of the favorite become a mortal blow to the immortal institution of the monarchy? The answer lies in the medieval concept of the king's two bodies. One physical and mortal, the other the body politic, eternal, symbolizing the state. Despenser, endowed with the monarch's will, became part of this body politic. Therefore, the accusation of possessing the king's soul was not just a legal formula. It was a public verdict on the incapacitation of Edward II's body politic. The crowd in Hereford did not see a man's execution. They saw royal authority itself being disemboweled and dismembered before their eyes. Every scream from Despenser was the audible embodiment of his patron's powerlessness. This was an attack on the king's shadow that, without touching his physical body, destroyed his authority. And the most personal blow was delivered through the most intimate aspect of the execution. Why was it necessary to castrate his favorite for the political humiliation of the king? The formal explanation was simple. The genitals were cut off as punishment for his treason against Queen Isabella for taking her place beside the monarch. The heart was burned for his heretical thoughts. But the real purpose was deeper. The castration of the favorite was a public insinuation of Edward II's alleged homosexuality, of his inability to govern the male world of politics. The burning of Despenser's heart was a metaphor. The heart of the kingdom, the king himself, was tainted with corruption and needed to be cleansed. Even the quartering of the body and the sending of its parts across England was not just an act of intimidation. It was the symbolic disintegration of the kingdom itself under the rule of a weak monarch. After such a symbolic assassination of the king, all that remained was to deal with his physical shell. The moment Despenser died, King Edward II effectively ceased to be a ruler. After his flight and capture came a humiliating abdication of the throne in favor of his son. But losing the crown was not his main humiliation. He was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and, according to chroniclers, kept in a cell directly above a pit of rotting animal carcasses, so the stench would break his will. The legend of his death by a red-hot poker inserted into his anus is the perfect propagandistic end to the story. It punished the king for his alleged sins in the same way he had been symbolically humiliated through his favorite's execution. It was the coldest political move in history. It allowed for the complete demoralization and destruction of the monarch without formally spilling a single drop of sacred royal blood. We are used to thinking that coups are carried out by armies. This story proves that sometimes a single perfectly staged spectacle is enough. And so the central mystery of our investigation is solved. Hugh Despenser required such a brutal execution because every element of it was a blow against King Edward II. It was necessary for the symbolic assassination of the monarch and the demonstration of his powerlessness. But Isabella and Mortimer created something more. They were the first in English history to realize they could use the formal procedure of a treason trial as the primary tool for overthrowing a monarch. They turned justice into a weapon. Their strategy consisted of 2 steps. First, the symbolic destruction of authority, then its formal removal. Despenser's execution is not just revenge disguised as justice. It is a coup d'état disguised as justice. They proved that to seize power, you don't need to storm a castle. You just need to conduct the right trial. The lessons from this arsenal create a universal toolkit that allows us to read the hidden messages of power in any era. The first lesson from this arsenal: the danger of indispensability. Power built on personal loyalty to a ruler, rather than on institutions and law, is inevitably perceived as tyranny. The higher Despenser rose thanks to the king's favor, the more his rule resembled a dictatorship in the eyes of the barons, whose rights were based on tradition. Every step he took, even when sanctioned by Edward, destroyed not his enemies, but the legitimacy of the crown itself. He proved that the will of one man had become higher than the law. This turned him into a mortal threat to the entire political system. His story is a textbook example of how dangerous it is to be indispensable. When a system of power centers on a single individual, its collapse is only a matter of time. Such power is like a bridge supported by a single massive pillar. It looks strong, but if that single support is destroyed, the entire structure collapses instantly and completely. Have you ever seen an indispensable employee become toxic to an entire system? The second lesson: cruelty as a political language. In moments of acute crisis, power stops speaking with words and begins to communicate through rituals. Public cruelty becomes the loudest and clearest message. The 14 articles of accusation were a press release for the elites. But for the illiterate masses and for the entire country, a different message was needed. Visual, shocking, unforgettable. To prove the king's incompetence, declarations were not enough for Isabella and Mortimer. They needed a show that would emotionally convince everyone they were right. Every element of the execution was a word in this bloody message. Public ritual violence is not a system failure. It is a carefully calibrated communication tool that power uses when ordinary words lose their force. The body of an enemy becomes a political manifesto. The 4 parts of Despenser's body were sent to the largest cities, covering a distance of over 200 kilometers. It's like sending a single message to the country's 4 main television networks. We tend to think of cruelty as a sign of chaos, but this story proves the opposite. It is a sign of cold and utterly rational political calculation. The third lesson: destruction through symbols. The most effective way to overthrow a leader is not through direct attack, but through the public destruction of the symbols on which their power rests. The legacy of Despenser's execution is so great precisely because it was a masterful strike against symbols, not the man. People remembered not so much his crimes as the humiliation of the crown. Despenser was the perfect symbol. He embodied the personal will of the king, his authority, and, in the eyes of his enemies, his vices. By destroying the favorite so humiliatingly, the rebels were not destroying a man, but the very belief in the monarch's infallibility. The execution of Hugh Despenser is a masterclass in symbolic warfare. It proves that a coup does not always require an army. A single spectacle that shatters the enemy's legitimacy in the eyes of the people is enough. This was a coup carried out in the minds of the people, not on the battlefield. 3 goals were achieved with a single blow: punishing an enemy, destroying a king, and seizing power. We have examined all the lessons. Now only one final question remains, which only you can answer. Now, it's your verdict. Was it justice or revenge? Hugh Despenser was no innocent victim. He was a corrupt tyrant who abused his proximity to the king. His crimes were real, documented in the 14 articles of accusation. By the laws of the time, he deserved the harshest punishment. But his judges, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, were themselves rebels committing a coup d'etat. The cruelty of the execution was clearly disproportionate and served not so much to punish as to humiliate the king. The main target of the spectacle was not Despenser, but the throne, which turns the trial into a cynical settling of scores. We ask you to be the jury in this historical case. Write a single word in the comments that summarizes this investigation: justice or revenge. Your vote will be the final word in this 700-year-old case.